but I don't know. We were supposed to. It was going to be one of our modules, and they couldn't find where our boys' class was.
Hey there, can somebody let me know if you can see the slides?
Yes, ma'am, I can see it.
Oh, perfect. Okay. Okay, so we've got about 2 minutes till we get started. So this is being recorded. This is the first time I've done this through Teams. I think it's webinar. I'm not really sure why the camera is off. And I don't want to mess with it too much until we get till we get it rolling. I'm scared to mess with it being new. But hopefully everyone can see the slides. For me, what I see is when I pull up the section that's got all the attendees, I just see a black screen. So somebody has let me know that you can see the screens. I've also let everyone know that I can't read. Hold on. Somebody just typed in the chat, can I talk so we can test sound? Can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am, I can
Yes.
Okay. All right. Perfect. Okay. Wonderful. So again, what I see is a black screen. So I appreciate you letting me know that you can hear me and that you can see the slides. And we're going to get started in just 1 minute. But again, if you'll do me the kindness of typing questions that you have in the chat, I will get to them later. And again, we'll just figure out what we're doing with this new version of Teams webinar so that we can make sure that it's recorded.
Angie, I have our team joining on Google Meet and I'm sharing my screen. Would you prefer that I share this link directly with them?
If you're all together, stay on the one screen.
Okay.
And that will just help with sort of with the bandwidth and making sure making sure everyone can see it. I have shared a copy of the slides as a handout if you want to go ahead and send that to them.
Yep, I shared all of that, and we're just going to stay on our link after and do our discussion questions. I just wanted to make sure it was okay if we did it that way.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. Yes, it has already started recording as soon as I hit so that you could see the slides, it started recording. And okay, so here we go. It is 8:30, so we're going to dive right in. So here we go. So today, what we're talking about is the SLP's role in improving reading outcomes. And this is something that is so very near and dear to my heart. And it is something that I've been talking about with the lead SLPs, I think since August, about doing this type of presentation. And our purpose today is to really start thinking about what comprehensive information do we need to know as SLPs and to share with others as far as what we can do as speech language pathologists to support reading outcomes for students with a disability and maybe even some who don't. I will tell you that the number one question that I get is, will this training be available for CEUs? And so as speech language pathologists, what we know is that there are CEUs, and then there are also professional development hours, both of which, CEUs and PDH hours, those are both eligible for ASHA and South Carolina licensure requirements for continuing education. What you need, how a CEU is different from an PDH, is your CEUs typically go straight, or if you've signed up for the CEU tracker through ASHA, that will go straight on there. A PDH, you just keep a copy of the certificate. Now, one thing that's a little different about this presentation is I left the number of hours blank on the certificate. And the reason for that is because this webinar itself is 3 hours. But I've already shared with your lead SLPs and or SPED directors discussion questions so that you can take time to think about the information that's been presented and how this might apply to your district specifically, because every district is a little bit unique. So I wanted to make sure that I have provided a blank space to allow that time for that discussion. So your lead SLP or SPED director is actually going to co-sign your certificate, and they are the ones who are going to put the number of hours in there based on the amount of time that you spend. Now, if you are not watching this as a watch party, you're watching it alone or you're going to be watching the recorded webinar. There is a 12-question quiz that you'll need to complete in order to reflect mastery of the content. So your SPED director or your lead SLP already has the link for this 12-question quiz. Once you take that quiz, let them know, and then they will let me know so I can go in and quote unquote grade it. Now, if you are watching this with a group, with your watch party, with your lead SLP and everyone, you do not need to take the quiz. All right, so here we go. Let's get started. So here's the things that we're going to be talking about. We're going to talk about first, how language is everything. We're also going to talk about why it's important to understand the connection between spoken and written language. We're going to go have a good overview of the ELA standards, the new ELA standards. We're going to talk about prevention of reading disabilities as well as collaboration with our general education and special education partners. There's a beautiful section that I love called that really emphasizes how language is interwoven and overlapping. We're going to touch on assessment as well as application in specific areas. As I typed in the chat as well, we'll also take a 15-minute break about halfway through. Now, the first thing I want us to do is I want us to sort of pause and ponder. So to sort of get our brain sort of set and frame this discussion. So as speech language pathologists, I want you to think about how many of your current speech students are also in resource. They're getting special education services for reading. Is it a few or is it a lot? I also want you to think about how often or how frequently do you see that students will start with just speech, maybe in kindergarten or first grade, but then eventually they end up needing resource services to address reading difficulties. Now think about how quickly are we seeing students with either a speech language impairment or a specific learning disability in reading, how quickly are they returning to general education reading on grade level? Does that happen quickly or maybe not as quickly as we would like? And then I also want us to all think about how often are we connecting our IEP goals with our ELA standards? And before I take one more step further with that, it does not mean we have to write goals that are specific to the ELA standards. What it does mean is we have to have IEP goals that are aligned with it. In other words, we need to know what these standards are and how they connect with the student's deficits. And that is a big part of what we're going to discuss. But also, before I go too far into this, we're going to address the elephant in the room, which is all of these questions right here. How can SLPs add one more thing to their plate? Our caseloads are overwhelming, and SLPs don't teach reading. Well, let's go through each of those. So first, how can SLPs add one more thing to their plate? And without question, oh boy, howdy, I know speech language pathologists have a lot on their plate. You may or may not know this, but speech language impairment is the second largest category of disability, not only in South Carolina, but all over the United States. And that is based only on looking at the data on primary categories of disability. If you look at speech language impairment as a secondary disability or even as a related service, speech language pathologists support more students than any other special education service provider, bar none. We are also different from any other special education service because not only do we evaluate and provide services, we also bill Medicaid for both of those things. As far as our caseloads, yes, they're overwhelming, but even better said than our caseloads are overwhelming, our workloads are overwhelming. And this session is not at all meant to add anything to your plate, but to accomplish really two things. First, to consider the requirements of IDEA in an effort to better support appropriate initial eligibility, as well as ongoing eligibility, and also to make sure that we're supporting services that will help move students along the continuum of service delivery so that our workloads are less overwhelming. And as far as SLPs don't teach reading, well, a huge goal that I have today is to outline what reading is by breaking it down into its foundational components. And in doing so, I hope that you will come to the same conclusion that I have, that while SLPs do not teach children how to read per se, we do teach children the underlying linguistic skills, the language skills that are necessary in order for reading to take place. I also want to preface this with how I came to make the connection between language and literacy. When I was an outpatient speech language pathologist, I would have young children who would come I worked at Greenville Children's Hospital Kinetics, and I would have young children 2-3 years old, and they would come in and all they could say was ya or bubba. And so, yay me, I was able to get them to the point where they were intelligible by the time they started kindergarten. It was like, yay, this is awesome. They can start kindergarten and everybody will be able to understand them. But lo and behold, I would keep up with the families, and what I would find out is eventually those children ended up in resource. Maybe not all of them, but a good portion of them. So I started thinking there's got to be some kind of a connection between how words are spoken and understood and even put together, and how this connects to their ability to learn how to do this in the print modality as opposed to the spoken modality. So where I actually started my training on this was with the Linda Mood Bell program, the LIPS program, some of you may be familiar with, as well as the Visualizing and Verbalizing program. And then being the research nerd that I am, I just never stopped. So with that said, reading instruction is the responsibility of general education. And the most valid and efficient way to deliver early intervention and prevent reading failure later on is through general education. Now, there are several state and federal laws that outline what this should look like in your core instruction or tier 1 instruction. But we will also touch base on tiered instruction or tiered intervention as well. But I want to be very, very clear that schools can't intervene their way out of poor instruction. You also can't, quote unquote, sped your way out of poor core instruction. What the research tells us is that 80% of all students should be proficient readers based on core instruction. So if you look at your school's data and 80% of students are not reading proficiently on grade level, then there's a need to look closely and carefully at that core instruction and, big and here, how the collective we, special education, resource teachers, speech language pathologists, school psychologists, occupational therapists, how we can help support positive changes. So we're going to begin by looking at the federal law for Tier 1 core instruction. This is the Every Student Succeeds Act. So just like we operate under IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, general education operates under the Every Student Succeeds Act. So let's look at this closely. So first, let's look at the how. The federal law actually outlines how this instruction is provided. First, it says that it must be age appropriate, and we use our standards to help guide what that expectation is for in terms of age appropriate or really grade appropriate. We also, hold on, battery's being weird. That's the last thing we need to have happen. Hold on. Okay, we're back. Okay, so that's the how. So how means looking closely at explicit instruction, systematic instruction, intentional instruction. So explicit instruction, in the simplest terms, means it comes from my mouth to your ears, meaning we are telling students exactly what they need to know. We're not handing them a worksheet and saying, figure it out. So explicit instruction is direct instruction. Systematic instruction really and truly means that it moves along the continuum of simple to complex, and that we're not leaving gaps in there, again, that kids are supposed to just figure out. And intentional instruction, well, that means that we're really looking at how all of these skills overlap, and we're making those connections to how they overlap. The federal law also outlines exactly what skills need to be provided systematically and explicitly. Those include phonological awareness, phonics, vocabulary, language structures, which is really morphology and syntax, fluency, and comprehension. Now, this may seem familiar because it is a piece of every single bit of IDEA paperwork when we look at rule out factors. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But now, how do all of these skills align with what's referred to as the science of reading? If you haven't heard that term, you're probably going to be hearing that term more and more as your teachers are getting trained in letters. We're going to also talk about that in a moment. So how do all of these skills and this how to deliver this instruction, how does it align with the science of reading? Well, all of these things are based on the findings of the National Reading Panel. The National Reading Panel was published in 2000, so now 25 years ago. And what that National Reading Panel found, based on a variety, a huge plethora, an ocean of research, they found that the skills students need to be taught explicitly, systematically, and intentionally in order to become readers are all of the things you see here: phonological awareness, phonics, vocabulary, language structures, fluency, and comprehension. Now, the findings of the National Reading Panel, even though it was 25 years ago, their findings are so robust that the science continues to both support those findings and refine them. So now let's dig a little bit more specifically into language and the language aspects to each and every one of those skills. So let's begin with this. Oral language is the foundation for written language. One of my favorite things or favorite ways to explain this is to help others know and understand that yes, humans are biologically wired to acquire speech. We come out of quote unquote the box, and we don't have to be taught each and every sound, each and every word meaning, or even each and every morpheme. And actually nearly half of the brain is dedicated just to speech and language, just to speech and language. But there's nowhere in the brain specifically that you can pinpoint and say, that is the area specific to reading. Instead, reading requires the same areas of the brain that we use for language. The other thing to appreciate is that reading is not primarily a visual skill. I'll say that again. Reading is not primarily a visual skill. It's a language skill. How do we know that? Because blind people can read. If reading were primarily a visual skill, then blind people would not be able to read. Instead, they read, but through a different modality, through the tactile modality, as opposed to the visual modality. The other reason we know that reading is not primarily a visual skill is because those who are deaf or hard of hearing can read, but they typically only get to about a 3rd to 6th grade level of reading because of the oral language component. And again, oral language is the foundation for written language. And we use what we've already developed through spoken language, through our oral language, to form the networks that are necessary for written language. Now, preschool is not the topic of discussion today, but I really want to emphasize that is why it is so important, the work that we do for preschool and kindergarten, to create and ensure that oral language foundation. But bottom line is, whether you read it, you write it, you hear it, or speak it, it's all language. It's all language. So now let's break down language and its connection to reading and writing specifically. So first, literacy is a secondary system. Again, not the primary like we talked about. Literacy is a secondary system dependent upon language. So again, that oral language foundation. Also, each of the components of language play a vital role in reading and writing, meaning we can't skip some of the components of language or forget some of the components of language and expect children to be proficient in reading and writing. We also know there's a very strong relationship between early oral language and future reading comprehension as well as writing. And I think this one is super interesting. 70% of the variance in a 5th grader's performance on a state test for science, it's accounted for by their language ability. Because if you think about it, we're not just assessing science, we're also assessing language. Now, we know that there are 6 areas of language. We've got phonology, morphology, semantics, pragmatics, syntax, and then also discourse and narrative. Now, we've talked about ESSA, that every student's at CEGTET. Now let's talk about how each of those 6 areas of language have a connection to ESSA. So first is phonology. I love this quote. Phonological awareness has been shown to be more closely related to success in reading than intelligence or an IQ score. Phonological awareness is the strongest single predictor of word reading difficulties. And when we train phonological awareness skills, that improves the speed with which preschoolers and early kindergartners learn letter sounds. See how we're establishing that foundation? And the 2 best predictors of early reading success are alphabet recognition and phonemic awareness. And part of that alphabetic recognition is specifically related to the phonemic awareness. So I want you to think about it this way. As speech language pathologists, if you were to transcribe the letter B, his name, quote unquote, his name. The letter B was getting a name tag. We were transcribing how to write his name. We would typically write it as B-E-E. That's his name. But let's say we're trying to transcribe the letter name L. How would you write it? How would you transcribe that word L? You would probably write E-L. In other words, the point that I'm trying to get here is that knowing the letter name sometimes is difficult because the letter name does not directly correlate with the letter sound. So it gets sometimes obscured. And the best example of that is the letter W, which has no connection to its letter sound. We also know that comorbidity of reading disabilities with speech sound disorder, not just language, but just speech sound production, that's about 25 to 30%. And atypical speech sound errors and distortion in preschool are predictive of weak phonological awareness skills. And that's true even if they're language skills, even if we've assessed for language, and that's normal. It's just the speech sound production. And the majority of all poor readers have an early history of spoken language deficits, with about 73% of second grade poor readers having poor phonemic awareness or spoken language difficulties in kindergarten. And then finally, that atypical speech sound errors in preschool are predictive of school-age phonological awareness abilities. And if you've got a student and more than 10% of their speech has atypical errors, then they're more than likely going to have deficits in phonological awareness, which is then going to impact their reading and spelling. So a lot of connections between both speech sound production and phonological awareness, which again, that's one of the components of ESSA for explicit systematic reading instruction. Let's talk about semantics now. Children have to have mental imagery. In other words, when I say the word dog, you should be able to picture a dog in your head. So we have to have that mental imagery because that's what understanding a story requires. We have to be able to make these little mental movies in our head while we read. We also know that vocabulary knowledge at age 3 is predictive of reading comprehension scores at age 9 and 10, so roughly in 3rd grade. We also know that receptive vocabulary skills during preschool are strong predictors of reading in 2nd grade. Now, one thing that I want to sort of pause and hang out on is the difference between a language-rich and a language-poor environment. Now, many of us as speech-language pathologists are familiar with the Hart and Risley study. That's the story, the research from the 1990s that Hart and Risley did between children who were from low SES homes and those who were from middle and high SES homes. And what they found was, after a lot of transcription, is that there's a difference of about 30 million words in homes of low SES as compared to homes where it's middle or high SES. Now, however, we can't always rely on that. The reason is because our language environments have changed. In other words, we can have students from low SES homes, and they may actually come from a great language-rich environment. They could have a grandparent who talks their ear off. They could have a brother who takes them around on the four-wheeler in the woods, and they talk about all the things they see in the woods. They could have a sister who talks their ear off. That's a language-rich environment. By the same token, you could also have kids from middle and high SES homes, and there's not conversation happening. Instead of engaging in conversation in the car, they're getting on a screen. And that is not a language-rich environment. So we need to be very careful in just assuming, oh, it's only kids who are from low SES that we need to look out for. We now need to be paying close attention to the language environments regardless of socioeconomic status. Now let's talk about morphology. And I readily admit I tend to geek out a little bit on morphology and syntax, so apologies in advance. But there's a reason for that. And the reason is because about 80% of English words have multiple morphemes. And those morphologically complex words, well, that's the majority of what kids encounter in text. And the effects of morphological awareness on reading comprehension are consistent across all grade levels, meaning morphology and that morphological awareness is important for every grade level. And what we know is that children who have difficulty with reading and difficulty with language, they tend to have more difficulties with phonological knowledge. So this is an area that we need to pay close attention to. And part of the reason, and if you really think about morphology, and here's where I'm getting ready to geek out, think about Greek and Latin roots. When we talk about needing to improve vocabulary skills, we really need to also not just pay attention to definitions, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but we also need to think about morphology, because morphology, that gives away meaning. So a great example I love to use is the root mal, M-A-L. How many of you, even before you knew he was a bad guy, when you're reading Harry Potter, how many of you knew, based on that root mal, that Malfoy was probably going to be a bad guy? Because mal means bad. Now think about other words that you know that have the root mal. Malnutrition, malignant, maleficent. There's plenty of examples of how we can use morphology, especially knowledge of those Greek and Latin roots, to help improve our knowledge of vocabulary. Also, think about inflectional and derivational morphemes. Inflectional derivation, meaning they don't change the part of speech. So there's your plural S, past tense ED, those kind of things. But our derivational morphemes, they do change the part of speech. So that's like going from a verb to a noun, such as from encourage to encouragement, or from a verb to an adjective, going from select to selective, going from an adjective to a verb, from general to generalize, going from an adjective to adverb, such as beautiful and beautifully. So all of this is important, especially when we connect morphology and syntax. But I do want to share with you, just again, from a standpoint of application, here are the most frequent, top 5 most frequent inflectional and derivational morphemes. And what I want you to pay attention to here is the percent of the words that have this as a prefix. In other words, some of these occur a great deal. So this is something that we can use to help inform our instruction. I also want to point out with morphology and phonics, what that connection is. Again, because phonics is part of ESSA, but morphology is also part of phonics. So if you think about phonics or spelling, it's not a list of words. Phonics or spelling is really finding the patterns in words. And there are patterns that govern how we can add a morpheme or how it's represented by graphemes, or the letters and letter combinations, and even how it's connected to the sound. So think about, I'm going to start with the one at the very end, dog and dogs. How often do you see in a student writing sample where they write the word dogs with a Z? What that tells you is they're connecting to that phoneme, because absolutely the phoneme at the end of the word is Z, but they have not yet learned that plural is represented by an S or an ES, as you see with beaches and gifts and gifts. There's also patterns for what this looks like. So if you look at the words talked, hugged, and hunted, there's a pattern there. When the root word ends in a voiceless sound, k, that ED, it's going to also make the voiceless sound, which is t, but it's still represented by ED. When the root word ends in a voiced sound, like hugged, it's going to also, that ED is going to be represented by a voiced sound, d, hugged. But if the word ends in a T or a D, then that ED is going to be represented by a phoneme combination of id or ed, like hunted. Now let's look at even just the adding the morphemes to friend, friendship, friendly, friendless, unfriend. There's a pattern there of where we put those morphemes and how we put those together. So you're going to see a lot about this when we look at the ELA standards in a moment. Now let's talk about syntax. Beyond word knowledge, so above and beyond just vocabulary, syntax is probably the single most powerful deterrent to listening and reading comprehension. And if you've ever tried to read a very syntactically complex book, Shakespeare being a great example, or Game of Thrones, or Lord of the Rings, those are very syntactically complex sentences that are within those texts. And that makes the work of reading much more difficult. So proficient comprehension of text is influenced by your syntactic knowledge and a student's ability to write, to produce, and I'd go so far as to say orally produce complex sentences. Knowing those things, that improves their reading comprehension. And one thing to truly appreciate about syntax is that stories have their own secret language. In other words, the oral syntax that we use is different than the written syntax of story. So for example, if you were walking around outside and you saw an egg on a leaf, what would you say? You'd say, oh, look, there's an egg. But in a story, even like what we see in The Hungry Caterpillar, the syntax is more complex. And it goes, in the light of the moon, a little egg lay on a leaf. So the key takeaway there is the more kids are exposed to the secret language or secret syntax of story, the better they are when they start to begin to read it and comprehend it. The other thing to appreciate about syntax, and we're going to get into this when we talk about application, is a huge aspect of syntax is being able to cluster words together into phrases. Because if you've ever heard a struggling reader read, they don't read in phrases. They read one word at a time. So they might read that excerpt from The Hungry Caterpillar as, in the light of the moon, a little egg lay on a leaf. When they're reading word by word, they're not able to make those mental images. So if you look at the syntax this way and you think about it in terms of those phrases, in the light of the moon, you can picture what that light from the moon looks like. A little egg lay on a leaf. And you can use that to scoop that little mental image there. But you have to have that underlying understanding of how we put phrases together and the complexity with which is different in written text than oral text. Now, vocabulary and syntax. One of the most well-established findings in all of educational research is that it's not just about the individual words. So in other words, just teaching definitions, even providing that accommodation of pre-teaching vocabulary beforehand, that only is going to account for about half of the variance in reading comprehension, because vocabulary is not just knowledge of single words, but the relationship between the words. So a great example I like to use here is from Mark Twain, who says there's a big difference between lightning and a lightning bug. In other words, when you pair words together, it can change the meaning. And it also changes the image that you have. So when I said the word lightning, that gave you one mental image, but I said lightning bug, that gives you a different mental image. Now let's talk about narrative. Ooh, I also geek out on narrative. So narrative is really and truly just that ability to tell a story, to write a story, and think about fiction, to understand stories. And so when you struggle with stories, not only is that going to impact your educational achievement, it's also going to impact you socially, because that's what we do when we get together as humans. We get together and we swap stories. So narrative is a huge thing we need to make sure that we're assessing, especially for children when we suspect that there is difficulty with pragmatics. Narrative skills are also so important that at the age of 3, those narrative skills, so again, not assessing this once they start school, but even looking at them at preschoolers, because Oral language is the foundation for written language, but narrative skills at age 3 makes a direct contribution to reading comprehension at age 8 and 9. So even further down the road, and even narrative skills at age 5, it makes this whole separate independent contribution to reading comprehension at 10 and reading achievement at 14. And that's above anything else. That's above linguistic comprehension. It's just narrative skills. So it's above language comprehension, cognitive ability, verbal memory, and mother's education, which is also something that's usually thrown in there. That's how important narrative is. Narrative, I also want to point out, the new SE Ready, 3rd and 4th graders, their text-dependent writing is all narrative writing. They have to write a narrative. So when we think about the connection to educational success, this is a huge one. Now let's talk about pragmatics. Now we don't typically think of reading as a pragmatic skill or a social skill because we typically read alone. But actually, reading is where you're interacting with the characters, with the author or the narrator, and even the purpose or how the text is arranged. So you are interacting. The other thing to appreciate about pragmatics in reading is perspective. So understanding the perspective of the character and being able to understand a character's perspective, the only way you can make inferences, and inference is a big one, the only way you're able to make inferences is through perspective taking. But also written language or text also includes these other pragmatic skills. So we talked about point of view. It includes figurative language, separating important details from details that are not important, making inferences, making predictions, conveying point of view when you're writing, and then also making sure that we're providing essential details and specific reference. Now let's also talk about pragmatics in print with nonverbal communication. So I've got some of the aspects of nonverbal communication listed here, but we need to appreciate that those are also in our texts that the kids are reading. So I've got several examples here. So in the book To Killing a Mockingbird, Atticus Finch, he maintained steady eye contact. What does that mean? What is the student supposed to infer based on that nonverbal communication written in the text? If y'all can be sure and mute your microphones, that would be super appreciated. All right, so now let's go back to the Every Student Succeeds Act. So we've talked about phonological awareness and phonology. We've talked about phonics as it relates to morphology. We've talked about vocabulary. We've talked about language structures, more specifically syntax. But what about fluency and comprehension? Well, here we go. First, let's talk about fluency. So when we talk about reading fluency, prosody is a, if somebody can help me and press mute for everyone, I would appreciate that. If we look at prosody, reading with inflection, we also have to read with appropriate prosody. So I want you to look at this first sentence.
Miss Neal, you're muted.
Yes, I just unmuted now. Okay. Now let me get back. Okay, so if we're looking just at prosody for that sentence, what we have to appreciate, is that if you read it with that prosody, it sounds like an ad in the classifieds, for sale baby shoes never worn. But if you read it with appropriate prosody and inflection, it's a really heartbreaking story. For sale baby shoes never worn. And that actually comes from Ernest Hemingway. And he was challenged to write a story with only 6 words. And that's what he came up with. And I dare say that's a very powerful story. But again, if you're not reading it with appropriate prosody or you struggle with prosody, you're going to miss that meaning. Now let's talk about fluency as it relates to syntax. Think about where you put the stress in the sentence. So look at the sentence in the middle. The entire meaning of the sentence can change based on where you put that stress. Is it he broke the window as opposed to she or it? He broke the window as opposed to it's broken or it's cracked. He broke the window as opposed to the window or the door or something else. So again, syntax plays a critical role in fluency. Now let's think about fluency and phonology. Look at the list of words there. These are all words that, depending on the syllable stress, changes the meaning. So resume or resume, record or record, permit or permit, present or present, conduct or conduct, progress versus progress, object versus object. So again, all of those language skills can impact fluency. Now, what about comprehension? Well, let's talk about comprehension for a minute. Now, comprehension is often thought of, and it's even listed under ESSA as a single entity. Remember, go back to think about how ESSA lists all those components. Comprehension is listed as a single entity, but it's not. Comprehension is both the product of language skills and cognitive processes, that also is an interactive piece. While you're reading and comprehending, you're also applying background knowledge, the features of the text, the purpose and the goals of the reading situation. So comprehension is not one single thing. And language comprehension is intricately related to reading comprehension. So think about, again, oral language is the foundation for written language. So language comprehension is going to be directly correlated with reading comprehension. Now, thinking back to all 6 areas of language: phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, pragmatics, and narrative skills. Is there any of those 6 skills that you can say, nope, you don't need that for comprehension? No, you need all 6 of those. All of those language skills support or take away from comprehension. And a big takeaway is this: once children become competent decoders, competent readers, language comprehension is what determines their reading ability or the potential challenges for the reader. So let's think back to this comprehension processes versus comprehension products. So I want you to think about it this way. Think about like if you're building a car. When you're building a car, let's say you're Ford and you're building a car, there are several processes that have to be undertaken in order to get to that final product that you see here. But if those processes are interrupted, if those processes are missing, the product is not going to be the same. The product is not going to be effective. So the products of comprehension are truly the indicators of what the reader knows and understands once they finish reading. Remember, that's the car, that's the end of the line. So products of comprehension are what they show after they finished reading. But the processes, those are the cognitive activities for how they get there. How do they get to those answers? That's a very meaningful and clear distinction that needs to be made. So let's go through a few of them. So here's some examples. Comprehension processes, just like the building of the car, are things you can't see. You can't see them happening in their head. So you can't see someone understanding. You can't see someone making the connection between prior knowledge and new content, excuse me. You can't see someone rereading. You can't see someone going, oh, wait, that doesn't make sense. You can't see someone making mental movies, and you can't see someone making predictions. What you can see are the products. Basically, they're answers to the question. You can see the product of comprehension when they summarize, when they answer questions about like multiple choice questions. You can see it in their response to inference questions, like, why do you think? And you can also see it when they make an outline. So I want you to think with me about a few of these. So you can do this as a group, or you can just play along at home. But you tell me, which of these are a product? Which of these are a process? Now, again, think about the difference that processes are things you cannot see happening in their head. Products are things you can see. So writing a summary, is that a process or a product? It's a product, again, because you can see it. What about separating important from unimportant details? Can you see that happening? No, so it's a process. That's something we can't see. We still need to teach it. We still need to make sure they're able to do this, even if we can't see it, because that's how we get to the product. All right, what about understanding pronoun relationships? And what I really mean by that is, you ever heard somebody tell a story and the whole story is, well, she did that and they went over to the thing and then he grabbed the whatever. You have no idea what they're talking about. It's overuse of those pronouns where the speaker is assuming you know who these people are. So again, is that something you can see or not see? Is it a process or a product? It's a process. What about filling in gaps, making inferences? Is that a process or a product? It's a process. You can't see them inferring. You can see their answer to a question, but you can't see them making that inference. All right, this one should be easy because we just included it. Making an outline. Process or product? Product. Identifying what the theme or the main idea is. Is that a process or a product? Product, because we're seeing what their response is to that question. What about making predictions? Process or product? Process. You can't see them making predictions. All right, what about understanding connecting words? So, though, yet, or even structure cues or predictive cues. Can you see understanding? Is it a process or is it a product? It's a process. What about completing a KWL chart, a knowledge, oh gosh, now I can't think of the WL, but those kinds of charts. Completing it, that's a product because you can see it. What about monitoring their own comprehension while they read? Can we see that? Is that a process or a product? It's a process. And then finally, what about making those mental models, those mental images in their head? Can you see someone do that? No, so it's a process. So again, now let's go back to the Every Student Succeeds Act. Have we made the connection between the 6 areas of language and the federal law for general education instruction for reading, phonological awareness, phonics, vocabulary, language structure, fluency, and comprehension? Have we made those connections now? Yes. So it brings us back to that question that I asked earlier. If all of these things are language skills, do SLPs teach reading? No. Because if you look back to the components of Every Student Succeeds Act, that's the law that governs general education instruction. In other words, SLPs are not the only professionals in the building with valuable expertise in this area and how to support struggling students who are struggling with some of those areas. All of your general education partners and special education partners have to know and have familiarity with how to assess and how to teach those skills. But we can provide valuable support because language is our jam. So what I want us to consider is about the valuable contributions we can make to the team, to team-based problem-solving processes, and how we support struggling students. And that problem-solving process is not immediately, oh, it's language, send them to the SLP. The problem-solving process is first identifying what does the child need, then identifying how we know that's a need, And especially as we talked earlier about the rule out factors, and as we'll talk about again, how do we know they've been provided that instruction? And then the third question is, as a team, looking at those with the expertise, the time, and resources to address those needs. Because again, under IDEA, we have to consider the continuum of supports and services in the least restrictive environment. So, does this mean speech language pathologists should be providing tiered intervention? Well, very first, what I want to talk about is that when we talk about tiered intervention, first and foremost, intervention by anyone to target anything cannot be used to delay or deny the provision of a full and individual evaluation. In other words, if we suspect that this child has a disability, do not pass go. Start that full and individual evaluation. But if we're not sure if it's a disability or even a lack of instruction, that's when we need to gather more data through intervention. So again, to be clear, intervention before evaluation is not required when there's clear suspicion of a disability. And that includes intervention by the SLP, the reading interventionist, or anyone else. Now, intervention may, again, be warranted if you need more data because you're not clear. And to be very clear about the intervention itself, it has to be provided for a defined period of time. That period of time should be enough to provide targeted intervention. Exactly what does the student need? Provide it for a short period of time, which is usually about 6 to 8 weeks, but it varies. And then review the data. How did the student respond to that intervention? In order to know, okay, do we keep going with the intervention, or is it very clear now that we haven't made the progress that we need to? But we need to be approaching our intervention very intentionally. And we need to have two very important considerations. Number one, is the intervention evidence-based? Is there data? Is there research that says if we do this intervention, things will get better? Also, is the intervention matched to the need of the student? In other words, if we're providing an intervention that targets a bunch of different areas of language or a bunch of different areas of ESSA, but they only need phonological awareness, the longer they spend not getting that targeted instruction just in phonological awareness, the further they get behind their peers. So when we're looking at that intervention, and if it's matched to the needs of the student, we need to be asking my favorite question. How do you know? How do you know that intervention is supposed to make a difference? What's the evidence? How do we know that intervention is matched to exactly what that student needs? What assessment tools, what diagnostic tools do we use to determine that? And then number two, and I think this is one of the biggest ones, is there's a big difference between a student making progress and a student closing the gap. What do I mean by that? It means that if you're getting specialized instruction, any kind of different instruction than core instruction, you should be making progress. But is that progress enough to close the gap between that child and their same age or grade peers? It's a very different question. We need to be looking at, are they making enough progress fast enough in order to close the gap so that we're not spending months and years just making progress and falling further behind. And then finally, intervention by the speech language pathologist should not be used to supplant what should be happening or what should have been provided under core instruction, according to federal laws for general education. Now let's talk about all of these things under the lens of a language disorder, specifically developmental language disorder. We no longer call it expressive receptive, it's developmental language disorder. And what we know is that developmental language disorder affects about 1 in 10 children. This is in comparison to 1 in 36 children with autism, meaning it's very prevalent. And 50% of children with a developmental language disorder also have dyslexia, 50%. And the reason is because the universal cause of dyslexia is difficulty with phonological awareness, difficulty with that phonological component of language. But again, I caution you to say we have to determine whether or not it's a disorder in learning phonological awareness or having had the opportunity to have been taught it. That's that rule out factor. That's something to pay close attention to. So students with a developmental language disorder are 6 times more likely to have a reading disability, 6 times more likely to struggle with spelling, 4 times more likely to struggle with math because math is also a linguistic skill, and 12 times more likely to have difficulty with all 3 of those things. So what I want you to take away from this is when you see a young student struggling with oral language, it is highly unlikely that written language is going to be perfectly okay, because written language is just part of that continuum of language. It's language in the print modality as opposed to the spoken language modality. Big difference. Now let's look at specific learning disability and speech language impairment. About 85% of your students with a specific learning disability, their primary disability is in the area of reading, and the primary underlying deficit is language. 85% as opposed to 15% that could be something else. And students with language comprehension difficulties in kindergarten are likely to have reading comprehension difficulties in 3rd grade unless structured intervention is implemented. Again, making the case for looking at that oral language foundation early. And then also dyslexia, which is one of the areas of a specific learning disability. That's identifiable with 92% accuracy at the age of 5.5. At the age of 5.5. Why? Because again, difficulty with phonological awareness is the universal cause of dyslexia. And this is why we have those universal screening tools for dyslexia in an attempt to catch these difficulties. But the question is, what are we doing with the data gathered from these universal screeners? So what I want you to do is, again, I don't want you to think about SLP's involvement in improving outcomes in reading as a separate thing. I want you to think about the therapy we already provide by looking at it through the lens of literacy. Because again, as all that data that I've shared so far has demonstrated, when you have difficulty with speech sound disorders and or a language disorder, it is highly unlikely that you're not going to also see that impact in literacy. So it's not one more thing that we're adding, but it's rather applying our therapy and our therapeutic program under the lens of literacy. And when we do that, it does help create more manageable caseloads and workloads because of 3 reasons. First, we're making sure that we were accurately determining that this student was eligible because there was an adverse educational impact. We're going to dig more into that in just a bit. We're also gathering data that says there's ongoing adverse educational impact. And we're also making sure that we're providing supports along a continuum of services. So not everyone getting 2 times 30, but how are we ebbing and flowing and collaborating with our other partners? So now let's make this connection. We've talked about what the language foundations are. Now let's talk about why and IDEA. Why is it important to understand these connections, especially under the lens of IDEA? As I've already mentioned several times, first and foremost, IDEA has the rule out factor or the exclusionary factor that says you can't say this child has a disability if they have not been provided that instruction. Again, this is part of every single piece of paper that we do when we're determining whether or not a child is eligible. So we have to gather the data that answers this question. Have they been provided this instruction? And this is how IDEA eligibility in the school setting is different than any other setting. In any other setting, you would bill insurance. You would file through insurance. And Blue Cross Blue Shield, Humana, United Healthcare, Cigna, they all have requirements and stipulations for what they will and will not cover. IDEA does the same thing for the school setting. IDEA specifically states in Code of Federal Regulations, you see it right there, that in order to be eligible for services in the school setting, there has to be a disability, there has to be a need for specially designed instruction, and there has to be an adverse educational impact. For our preschool students, that specifically refers to their ability to participate in appropriate activities, which includes oral language. This one slide should really help frame and help our teams to frame what eligibility needs to be documented in order to receive services in the school setting. Now let's talk about the specially designed instruction aspect, because we really do need to dive a little deeper into that. What is special about what we provide in our instruction as speech language pathologists? Well, specially designed instruction means adapting appropriate to the needs of the student. So we have to gather that data on what those needs are, but we're adapting the content, the methodology, and the delivery of instruction, content, methodology, and delivery to address those unique needs that not every student has. For students with a disability, and here's the big part. I'd love for you to read it out loud with me. To ensure access to the general education curriculum in order to meet the educational standards that apply to all children. That is why we do what we do in the school setting. We provide that specially designed instruction so that students are able to meet educational standards that apply to all children. So you see this broken down even more here. But what I really want to talk about is, what does this really look like? We know these words, content, methodology, and delivery instruction. But what does it really mean? What it means is our instruction that is specially designed is different from general education instruction that's for everybody in ways such as we're developing those underlying skills. That's a huge part of what we do as speech language pathologists. We're also providing additional practice and feedback. We're giving more explicit instruction. We're providing more strategies to learn the content. We're providing additional scaffolding as well as repetition. That is specially designed instruction, and it needs to be based on the data that says, here's the unique needs of the student. And with this, I want us to think about whether the IEP goals that we're writing under that lens, are we providing IEP goals that are addressing needs from the top down or the bottom up? Specifically, when we see IEP goals for comprehension, we have to appreciate, especially when we look at reading comprehension, there is no comprehension strategy powerful enough to compensate for the fact that you can't read the words. In other words, if we're only addressing that top part of the pyramid and not those bigger foundational skills at the bottom, we're not going to have efficient and effective remediation of those comprehension deficits. We have to identify and address the root causes. And all of this takes us back to the fact that any kind of well-founded educational intervention, any intervention that we provide, it has to be based on a sound theory of the cause of that difficulty. In other words, are students struggling with comprehension because they can't read the words? And this has to be based on how children learn these skills. What does that scope and sequence look like? What are those developmental milestones? And again, as speech language pathologists, developmental milestones, that is our bread and butter. I'm also going to bring you back to this, and this is linked here, but there was a memorandum sent out in 2015 from the Office of Special Education Programs from the U.S. Department of Education. I'm going to give you a moment to read it alone. And now let's read the part in bold together. An IEP team must ensure that annual IEP goals are aligned with the state academic content standards for the grade in which the child is enrolled. Align with the state academic content standards for the grade that they're enrolled. Which leads to the obvious question of, well, what if they're significantly below grade level? Well, first we have to identify the gaps. Why are they significantly below grade level? What skills are they missing? And then once we know that, now we need to estimate what that rate of growth needs to be by targeting those gaps in order for them to get up to that grade in which they're enrolled. And we need to calculate what that rate of growth needs to be in order to close that gap. And our IEP goals, our annual goals, need to be ambitious but achievable. Specifically from that same letter from OSIP, the annual goals don't have to result in the child reaching that grade level standard within 1 year. I'll say that again. The annual goals don't necessarily need to have that child reach that grade level standard within a year, but the goal should be sufficiently ambitious to help close that gap. Sufficiently ambitious, which means we need to understand, number one, what those gaps are, and then the sequence of skills that they need to master and be taught to get to close that gap. We also have statements about what this means in terms of FAPE, free and appropriate education. The Supreme Court says there's 2 criteria for determining FAPE. First is compliance with IDEA. I've already shared a couple of the federal regulations with you so far. But the second is that IEP reasonably calculated in order to enable the child to receive educational benefit? In other words, to make progress towards the general education curriculum and standards. Those are the 2 ways we determine FAPE. So I want you to consider a few of these examples. So let's look at what you might see in a present level and then what you might see in a goal. So you might see a 3rd grade student who has a present level that says, student is able to read fluently at this point in time. Student is able to read fluently and accurately real or nonsense words with the long vowel silent E with 60% accuracy as measured by phonics assessment. So you might see that in a present level. Then the goal could be, we're going to have them read those real and nonsense words with vowel silent E with 80% accuracy. So going from 60% to 80%. But what questions do we need to ask? Take a moment and just think really carefully about what you see and what questions this leads you to ask. The first question I have is, at what grade level should the student have been expected to have been taught and mastered vowel, consonant, silent E words? What grade level? I'll go ahead and give you a spoiler alert. In South Carolina, the ELA standards to master and have been taught vowel, consonant, silent E words is 1st grade. So we have a 3rd grade student who's got present levels and a goal addressing a 1st grade skill. My other question is, what are the grade level skills that come before vowel, consonant, E, and have they mastered those? Oops. And then also, what comes after that? Because remember, we're trying to get that child to 3rd grade proficiency. So we don't want to just think about and target vowel, consonant, E, but what else do they need in order to reach those grade level standards? All right, now let's consider this example. Let's say it's a 6th grade student, and the present level says they're able to read 70 words correct per minute based on grade level reading passages. The goal is we're going to go from 70 to 85. So I want you to think for a moment, What questions does that lead you to ask?
Hey, babe.
Hey, dear.
All right, my first
Before,
question, someone please mute, please. Okay, so my first question is going to be, what are the norms for oral reading fluency for 6th grade? We're saying that they're at 70. We want to get them to 85, but what are those norms? Remember, what should we be targeting to get them to grade level standard? Well, here we go. This is the Hasbrouck-Tyndall norms. And so it will tell you exactly what we should be looking for. And so what we see here is a 6th grade student. If the goal is only to get them to 85 words correct per minute, that's only getting us right around, not even all the way to the window of fall of the 6th grade year at the 10th percentile. So this information is very important to know. And in order to target fluency, we need to make sure that we know what the skills are that the student is lacking in order for them to become fluent, because fluency is not a standalone skill. So similar to how ESSA had comprehension listed as a standalone entity, fluency is not a standalone entity. How do we know? How do we know fluency is not a standalone skill? Here you go. Let's say you have a 6th grader reading on a 6th grade level, and you give them a 3rd grade reading passage. What happens to their fluency? It goes up. Let's take that same 6th grade student, ask them to read a passage on a 9th grade level. What happens to their fluency? It goes down. So why does one cause the fluency to go up and one cause the fluency to go down? It's because they know the words. They know the syntax. They've mastered those foundational skills to get to that point. So again, fluency is not a standalone skill. It's the culmination of all of the other skills. And that's what allows them to read fluently. Now let's look at our final example. Let's say it's a 4th grade student, and they're reading on a level H with 90% accuracy. So again, and they're answering 8 out of 10 comprehension questions. So again, it's 4th grade, that's their present level. They're reading on an H. The goal is to get them to a level J. And again, answering 8 out of 10. So the goal is to go from where they are with a level H to a level J. So now I want you to, again, think about what questions this leads you to ask. The first question I have is, what does that student need to be taught in order to go from one level to the next? What skills allow them to move up through the levels? I'll give you a short answer to that. There's not. There's not a reliable difference between the levels. So we have to ask, are alphabetic reading levels valid and reliable? Are they valid and reliable methods of assessment to determine where exactly that student is and what they actually need? And again, have they been taught the foundational skills using scientifically based methods? And when we talk about scientifically based methods, we're specifically excluding the method called the 3 cueing method. Let's get into that. So first of all, when we talk about valid and reliable, ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act, your general education federal law, it requires valid and reliable assessments. IDEA also requires valid and reliable assessments. And both of them require that the assessments provide relevant information to help us determine what the needs are. So are alphabetic reading levels scientifically based on research? Are they valid and reliable? Well, what we know is that oral reading fluency has higher diagnostic accuracy and results in 80% correct classifications compared to 54% for alphabetic reading levels, such as the Fountas and Pinnell benchmark assessment system. So if you're looking at valid and reliable, diagnostic accuracy. Which one is more helpful? Oral reading fluency at 80% or 54%, barely more than flipping a coin? Yeah, we're going to go with oral reading fluency because it does have higher diagnostic accuracy. The key takeaway here being that leveled books focuses on the material in the books, not the instructional strengths or needs. And it's not based on evidence because, again, there's not a reliable or measurable difference between an H and a J. And that's why we can't answer that question of, okay, well, if we're going to move them from an H to a J, what do they need to be taught in order to move from an H to a J? No one is able to answer that question, which leads us to ask then, what are we actually teaching them in order for them to get to that next level? And South Carolina's state law, Read to Succeed, when it was renewed in 2024, has several key components you need to be aware of. First, we have to be using scientifically based reading instruction. In other words, it's got to have evidence that it's effective, that it's going to improve reading. And I love this. We also have included in our Read to Succeed that instruction includes oral language. Because again, look, this includes pre-K through grade 5. So we need to make sure oral language is represented along with those other areas of phonological and phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. State law also requires valid and reliable assessments. It also requires scientifically based interventions that have evidence that they're effective. And state law says that we must exclude curriculum and materials that have the 3 cueing system. The 3 cueing system, if you're not familiar with it, is essentially where students, when they get to a word that they don't know, they're instructed to either look at the picture, see if the picture might help them figure out what the word is, reread the sentence, figure out what word might go in there, or even look at the first letter and think about or guess what word it might be. The problem with the 3 cueing system is it's not actually teaching them to decode the word, because the best way to figure out what that word is to decode the word. And decoding the word is actually faster and more efficient than doing all of these other things. The big problem with the 3 cueing system, though, too, is once you get into grades 3 and above, the words are longer, so they're harder to decode. There's less pictures, and the sentences are more syntactically complex. In other words, the 3 cueing system is not setting them up for success. Also, here's what the research shows. When we give those types of prompts, that only works about 10% of the time. But when we decode the word and we sound it out, and then we also use those clues, that works about 100% of the time. So if you were buying a reading lottery ticket, if you were signing your child up for school and it was a lottery ticket in terms of which method of reading instruction would ensure that they will win the reading lottery, nearly 100%, would you go with that something that only works 10% of the time or something that works 100% of the time? Yes, I thought so too. We also know that that 3 cueing system, that's how poor readers read. Because poor readers can't decode the words, they look at the pictures, they try to guess based on the first letter, and they try to guess based on what the sentence. So 3 cueing system actually is teaching them to be a poor reader, as opposed to teaching them word attack skills to be able to decode the words. And how does this relate to scientifically based reading instruction? Well, first of all, as a speech language pathologist, and when you look at this part of the brain, what do you see? What jumps out? All of the language areas, Broca's and Wernicke's areas. But it also helps us to pinpoint the fact that everybody learns to read the same way. Everybody has to be taught the same way. But when you struggle, you need that additional support. But when it comes to reading, we all have roughly the same brain that imposes the same constraints and that require the same sequence of instruction. And has this worked? Has science of reading improved reading outcomes for students in South Carolina? It has. So our Palmetto Literacy Project schools were the first to begin letters training. We'll go over that in just a minute. And to also use curriculums aligned with the evidence, aligned with the science of reading. And so what we're starting to see as we look over time is that all students have improved about 10.5%, almost 11% over 4 years. But our students with disability, they've also improved. They've improved about 5.5% over 4 years. And the reason we also put not just the meets or exceeds data, but the approaching data, those students who are approaching meeting or exceeding, the reason we put that in there is because these are the ones that are right there on the bubble. This is what we refer to as the low-hanging fruit. And that if we just give them that little nudge, if we think about our therapy through a literacy lens, if we start collaborating more with our general education and special education partners, how can we just nudge those numbers just to go from approaching to meets or exceeds? So here's what you need to know about letters. And the reason I really specifically wanted to include information about letters is because all teachers, K through 3, and SPED teachers, special education teachers teaching grades K through 3, will be going through letters training. At one point, speech language pathologists were able to take letters or required to take letters. They are no longer, to be clear, speech language pathologists are no longer required to take letters. But let me pause here for a moment. What does letters stand for? Because letters is an acronym, and it stands for Language Essentials for Teachers of Reading and Spelling. Language. So I really wanted to hone in on a few of these things related to letters because this is what your teachers are learning. And hopefully what will start to happen is this will open a more of a dialogue between speech language pathologists and our general education and special education partners because it's all language. So it's so much so that letters is broken down into 2 volumes over 2 years. So letters, volume 1 or the first year is focused on word recognition, which you see in the blue box. The second year is on language comprehension, which you see in the red box. There's also an early childhood letters. And early childhood letters is a focus on that oral language foundation, the foundational skills we need in oral language to support both word recognition and language comprehension. So again, when you hear talk about letters, you're hearing talk about language, all of those things that I went over earlier. And now when we talk about the science of reading and how letters is broken down, I want to point out the simple view of reading. That's what you see in the colored boxes. This is the currently only theoretically accepted model for how children learn to read. The only one that says this is how children learn to read. At this time, this is the only model. And what it says is that word recognition multiplied by language comprehension, that's how you get to reading comprehension. And there's a few big takeaways from that. One of them being that it's multiplicative. In other words, let's say your child can decode words, they've got word recognition, but they have no idea what these words mean. Will they get to reading comprehension? No. Okay, so what if they can't decode words, but you've read the passage aloud to them? Will that get them to reading comprehension? No. All right, now let's say you've got a little bit of word recognition skills and a little bit of language comprehension skills. That's going to leave you with a little bit of reading comprehension skills. So you've got to have both word recognition and language comprehension in order to get to reading comprehension. So the huge takeaway, if I could stand on the desk that I'm sitting at right now and shout this from the rooftops, this is one of the big takeaways I hope you get from this. And that is anytime that there's a question about a student, who is struggling with reading, the first question, the very first question we should always ask is, if you read that passage aloud to them, could they accurately answer the comprehension questions? If the answer is yes, yeah, if I read this passage aloud, they can answer all the comprehension questions. We immediately go back to, it's the word recognition. That's the area of difficulty. So it's narrowing down what it possibly could be the cause of the reading difficulties. But let's say the teacher says, okay, yeah, no, if I read the passage aloud to them, I'm not sure they could answer all of the comprehension questions. Now we're looking at, it could be recognition as well as, or only, language comprehension. So that means that's going to require a little bit more discovery and a little bit more information. But immediately, this one question helps simplify not only what our assessments need to be looking at, including our diagnostic assessments, but also what our interventions might need to be targeted to address. As opposed to addressing everything, we can target those interventions. Now, what do we mean when we say word recognition and language comprehension? What does that mean? Well, for that, we have Scarborough's reading rope. So Hollis Scarborough in 2001 came out with this rope that is based on the simple view of reading. So we see word recognition at the bottom, we see language comprehension at the top. And so what Hollis Scarborough did is she pulled out what are the skills under each of those areas. So what you see here in word recognition is you see phonological awareness, decoding, and automatic recognition of words. Not the same thing as sight words. Not the same thing as memorizing words, to be very clear. What about language comprehension? What does that include? Well, it includes background knowledge, vocabulary, language structures, verbal reasoning, and literacy knowledge. And what happens is the reason this is a rope is because what it talks about is these are like strands of a rope. So if you're missing any of these skills, the strength of the rope is weakened. But as we combine and blend and weave all of these skills together, that's what leads to skilled reading. Now, what does this have to do with language? Vocabulary. There's our semantics. Language structures. There's our morphology and syntax. Verbal reasoning. That's our pragmatic skills. That includes your figurative language, your metaphors, making inferences, which are based on perspective taking. Literacy knowledge. That includes our narrative skills, because narrative is a form or genre of literacy, of print. Phonological awareness and decoding, there's your phonology and morphology. So all of the areas of language are represented not only in the simple view of reading, but it's broken down specifically by what those skills are. So again, this helps us when we're looking at our assessments, the data that we gather, and the intervention we provide. Now we're going to pause here and take a break for 15 minutes. And we'll begin with the ELA standards for South Carolina. So let's do this. I'm going to take a break. We'll come back at 10:15, so a little bit longer than 15 minutes, but we'll take a break. I'll look through and see if there's any questions in the chat. So if you have questions, you can go ahead and ask them there, or you can save them for the end. But we will come back at 10:15.
I'm just listening.
Okay, I've got 10:15. If someone will just check back with me and let me know sound is good and picture is good, that would be appreciated.
You're good.
Sound is good.
Thank you. Okay, so now let's dive into the ELA standards, and now we're kind of on the downward slope. That was a lot of heavy like research stuff like that, which I love. So I hope y'all enjoyed that as much as I enjoyed sharing it. But it was heavy and technical. So now we're getting a little bit more into the fun, more applicable side. I did answer some of the questions in the chat, and I'll do the same when we get to the end. But for now, let's get started. Okay, so first thing, what do we need to know about the new ELA standards? So one of the things you need to know is, number one, as a speech language pathologist, I was able to help on this committee to write the English language arts standards. So huge highlight of my career, but I say that to say, I want you to know language was strongly represented. And you're going to see that when we go through some of the standards. But I also want you to know that ELA standards, all standards really, as per state law, they're required to go through review every 7 years. Every 7 years, you can decide if you want to change them or not. But these were done because it was time to have them done. They were approved by the governor in 2023, and they are required now, as in today, as in August or July, whenever you started school. Teachers should have been teaching according to these ELA standards. These standards are aligned with ESSA, Federal Law for General Education. They're aligned very well with the LETRS training, as well as the National Reading Panel and the Science of Reading. And so I've got linked here the document that explains how these ELA standards were written. So if you really feel like doing a fun deep dive, you can go to page 11 and it will show you. The other thing I wanted to show you and provide you a link to is a direct link to where you can find them. So our ELA standards you can find on the South Carolina Department of Education website. So you've got the box there that says standards. That'll just take you straight to the standards. There's also an abundant amount of resources, recorded webinars, handouts, all kinds of things that you can find under instructional resources. And the Office of Assessment and Standards continues to put out professional learning opportunities. So you can find all of those under that link. Now, here's the key things you need to know about the South Carolina ELA standards. Because if you're not familiar with the ELA standards, it can seem really overwhelming. What do you mean these are all of the skills and strategies we have to teach from kindergarten through 12th grade? That's a lot of stuff. So it's organized in a way to make it make sense. So first of all, there are 4 strands. And there's also what we refer to as overarching expectations. I'll get more into that in just a minute. But as far as the 4 strands, these apply to kindergarten through English 4, so all the way through high school. That includes applications of reading. What does applications of reading include? I'll get to that in a moment. But what I do want to share with you while we're on this moment is there are 3 specific standards under the strand of application of reading just on vocabulary. Just on vocabulary. Another strand is what they refer to as the foundations of literacy. When we talked about the simple view of reading and word recognition, that's where most of this lives. And so that's really just for primarily kindergartners through 2nd grade. There's a few up into 3rd grade, but it's primarily for kindergarten through 2nd. Now there's a very cool tool that everyone has available to them for the foundations of literacy. So I'll keep you in suspense on that for a moment. There's also a research strand, and then there's also written and oral communications, which is, again, sort of our bread and butter. That's our jam. Now, how are the new ELA standards different from the old ones? We reduced them significantly, but we didn't lose anything. We just made them more clear. So we reduced the number of strands. So like I said, there were 4 plus overarching expectations. We reduced them 33%. We reduced the number of standards by 50%. And we reduced the number of indicators 56%. So coming from my own perspective of trying to connect to the ELA standards before these were written, it was overwhelming. It was very overwhelming, and it almost made no sense in terms of how do I connect my IEP goals? How do I assess with the grade level standards in mind? It was overwhelming. Not anymore. So very important specifically for our students with a disability, I really want us to be thinking about those foundations of literacy standards, those foundational skills. And again, they reflect explicit, systematic instruction. Again, that should sound familiar based on ESSA and based on IDEA and their rule out factors. Foundations of literacy skills related to phonemic and phonological awareness, phonics, fluency, and concepts of print. Now, what's the difference between a standard and an indicator? This one is really important to know. So if I want you to think about it this way, a standard is what they're expected to know over their entire academic career. So standards cross grade levels. Indicators are grade level specific. So when I talked about the scope and sequence, what do they need to know? You need to look at the indicators for each grade level, because that's what's going to tell you exactly what that instruction needs to look like systematically and how do we identify and close those gaps. Now, when you look at the standards, this is the secret code. So the key secret code is essentially, yes, these are ELA standards as opposed to science or social studies. Then the very first number is for the grade level. So ELA 6 is for 6th grade. ELA 1 is for 1st grade. Then you get into those 4 strands plus overarching expectation. It'll tell you which strand that is in. Then it will tell you the standard and the indicator. So that's the secret code. Now, how do our new ELA standards align with the simple view of reading, currently only a theoretically accepted model for how children learn to read, and the skills within it? How does it align? Overarching expectations includes a lot of the background knowledge pieces. Our applications of reading strand, that includes your vocabulary, the language structures, all of those other things. And then the foundations of literacy really goes deep into those word recognition strands. So again, the science, the research is all aligned through our ELA standards. So now let's go through some specific ones. We're not going to go through all of them, but I want to go through some of these specific strands and indicators. And I want to see what you see. What jumps out to you in terms of language? What jumps out at you in terms of skills that we either already assess or could assess, and then how that might translate into documentation of adverse educational impact, as well as our impact statements on our IEP. So first, for overarching expectations, we've got read and write for a variety of purposes, including academic and personal. Acquire, refine, and share knowledge through a variety of ways, including oral presentations. Make inferences, collaborate, use active listening skills, cite evidence, and justify reasoning. Create quality work. So those are your big overarching expectations. So these are not separate skills. The reason they're referred to as overarching expectations, is because these should be integrated throughout each standard, throughout each grade level. In other words, they arch over everything. So they're not separate. We wouldn't say you only need this in this grade level or this grade level or this strand or this strand. They are part of everything comprehensively. So again, what jumps out at you? And I think I got my animations a little messed up, but what stands out to me is the inferencing, collaboration, the active listening, justifying reasoning. Now, what about applications of reading? And again, I see the animations are a little off today, but that's okay. So first, we're looking at key literary elements. We're looking at development of themes, central ideas, summarizing and paraphrasing, clarifying the meaning of unknown and multiple meaning words and phrases, word relationships. Remember, we talked about that earlier under syntax. We talked about academic vocabulary, as well as morphology. So all of these things I hope jump out at you as things that either you do assess or could assess or gather data, at least from the classroom teacher on, because this is your standards for grade level instruction. So again, this is something we could be gathering data on. Now, in terms of written and oral communication, writing arguments, relevant evidence, expository text, writing and informatory and expository text, explaining complex ideas, narratives, grammar, which is your syntax and morphology. And I'm going to show you the grammar conventions matrix in just a moment, but there's a link here. Revising your writing. And I want you to think about that under the lens of pragmatics, because pragmatics requires metalinguistic awareness, the ability to think about your own thinking. So some of our students may struggle with revising and editing because they're not able to think about their own thinking. So what jumps out here for me in terms of language, reasoning, relevant evidence, analyzing and explaining, narratives, that's one whole aspect of language. Grammar, again, we just spoke about that. Improving that clarity in the metalinguistics. Evaluating, critiquing interactively through listening and speaking. And then here's the grammar and conventions matrix. I love this so much. But again, being a huge language nerd, it's right up my alley. What I want you to take away from this document is it outlines what the expectations are for when the concept, that grammar concept, first appears in the grade level. So for example, in kindergarten is when we first start providing instruction about punctuation marks. But we also need to appreciate when it should be fully developed. However, as speech language pathologists, what I really want us to focus on is you have to have it in oral language before you can understand it in written language. Again, going back to that oral language foundation. So think about what this means in terms of our assessment. And when we're looking at if they're using compound sentences, if they're using declarative sentences, those kind of things, if they don't have that in oral language, how might this impact their access and progress with the standard? And when is it expected? Now, in terms of foundation of literacy, what are we looking at here? What are those language things that jump out that we do assess or that we could assess or gather data on from the general education teacher? What jumps out at me is phonological awareness, phonemic awareness. I'm going to go through the differences in just a bit. Word analysis. And a lot of that has to do with analyzing the morphemes. And then also, as it relates to fluency, is reading with accuracy and expression. Now, I told you a moment ago that there was a tool that anybody and everybody can use to look to see which of these indicators under this standard, which of the indicators a child might be missing. Now I'm going to show you that tool, and I have shared this again with the handouts and another handout with your speech lead and also or your director of special education, whoever's the primary contact. So let's go over quickly this tool. So it's called the Indicator Aligned Inventory for Word Recognition. Now, the word recognition aspect takes us right back to that question we need to ask if a student is struggling with reading. Remember what it was? If a student is struggling with reading, the first question we should ask is, if you read the passage aloud, could the student accurately answer the comprehension questions? If the answer is yes, the words on the page are the problem. Word recognition is where we need to do a deeper dive. So this tool, it's just an inventory, like a grocery list. We're going to go to our pantry and we're going to say, okay, well, for this recipe, I need this, this, and this, but I don't have this. That tells us either what we need to buy, or in this case, what we need to teach in order to make that recipe. So the indicator aligned inventory, or the IAI for word recognition, is specifically aligned with grade level standards for South Carolina's ELA standards. This is what makes it different from any other tool. And there are plenty other tools that are great. So for example, Kilpatrick has the PAST, or the PAST-T, depending on what you call it, and it's specifically for phonemic and phonological awareness. But it's not aligned specifically to the expectations of our state's grade level indicators. So that's how it's different. It's not good, it's not bad, it's not indifferent. It's just a different type of tool for a different purpose. We also have other tools, even as part of our own assessment batteries, that look at phonological awareness. But this one will tell you exactly what the expectation is based on the grade level indicator within our standards. So it covers all of these specific standards. It covers phonemic and phonological awareness, concepts of print, phonics for decoding and encoding, and fluency. The other thing that it does, and I have to pause for some emphasis here, is this document includes information about which phonemes a student who speaks with a dialect or who speaks another language that's not English, which of those phonemes might not be present in their language or dialect. So we need to use that information to give consideration for not counting it off as wrong or not saying they have a disability, but rather to say, have we made sure we've taught the phoneme and taught what it looks like in print, that we've taught the grapheme. So I had to pause and give a lot of emphasis on that. The other thing that this tool does, as I said, was it's going to give you a breakdown. It's going to give you your scope and sequence. So when you're looking at closing the gap, you can go specifically to this page where it's breaking down the findings by standard and grade level indicator, mark exactly which ones they struggled with, and use that over time to close the gap, to provide that free and appropriate education so that we can make sure they're getting that educational benefit so that we're efficiently and effectively closing that gap. Now let's talk about prevention and collaboration. Prevention and collaboration. And the way I'm going to start first talking about prevention is through one of my most favorite articles that comes from Dr. Suzanne Adloff and Dr. Tiffany Hogan. And if you're a language nerd like I am, and or if you went to USC, University of South Carolina, and you took a class under Dr. Suzanne Adloff, I just can't even tell you how much I love this article. But what it starts with, actually what the title of it is if we don't look, we won't see. In other words, if we're not looking for these language weaknesses, we won't see them and we won't intervene. And if we aren't intervening, especially at an early age, we're not preventing what could become a disability. We're only treating those symptoms later on in a comparison to traditional medicine. So here's the data that supports it. Most late emerging poor readers had difficulty with oral language weaknesses in kindergarten through second grade. I'll say it again. Most of our poor readers that we only identify in third grade, and we do identify most of them in the third grade, they had difficulties with language, oral language, in kindergarten through second grade. And we didn't see it. We didn't identify it. But as the research shows, if we had identified it and we did address it, it is possible that those negative impacts could be prevented or reduced. Here's more data. We estimate that the number of children who are typically identified as poor readers and then receive special education or compensatory services, such as intervention programs, that number of special education students could be reduced by up to 70% 70% through early identification and prevention. And again, if we don't look though, we won't see. And given that if we see it, if we identify it, that's what paves the way for treatment, whether through core instruction or tiered instruction or special education instruction. So what we really need to focus on is we need to be looking at the oral language foundation in order to prevent disabilities and or to intervene at early stages to reduce the impact of the disability. Now, when we talk about screening, what I want us to appreciate is, yes, we are one of almost every single state in the United States that requires dyslexia screening or universal screening tools. What I want you to appreciate, though, is what are we getting? What's the data that we're getting from these universal screening tools, and then what are we doing with it? So what I want you to appreciate, though, is most of the universal screening tools that are available, many of them are really not as sensitive as you might think to the word recognition difficulties, specifically phonological awareness, as you might think. They're not as sensitive to phonological awareness and those other components of word recognition as you might think, specific to dyslexia. But even fewer of them are sensitive to language comprehension because the focus of those early universal screening tools is not language. It's really looking more specifically at that word recognition strand. Now, because oral language and phonological awareness play a predictive role, in other words, if they're struggling with these things, we can predict they're going to have difficulty later on. We need to really be looking at these things in first and second grade, as opposed to even kindergarten. So we need to give them that opportunity to develop oral language. We need to give them that opportunity to develop those word recognition skills through instruction, but we also need to be monitoring it, because interventions that improve language also improves reading or reading comprehension. Now, before anyone jumps to starts to peel you off the ceiling, this does not mean the speech language pathologist is the only person who can screen for language. I'll say it again. This does not mean that the SLP is the only person who can screen for language. I'm going to give you examples of several screening tools that are also connected to intervention programs that can be administered by general education partners. And remember, our general education partners are expected to be providing the instruction and assessments according to ESSA. So it's not just the SLP who should be addressing these areas specifically. So that's why we're really talking about screening tools that can be administered by the SLP and or other educators. And that could be your reading interventionist. It could be the classroom teacher. It could be someone else. I don't know why my slides keep skipping. But the first one I want to talk about is called Language Screen. And I'm not paid by any of these. I'm just sharing information about what's available and out there. So first is the one called Language Screen. This is by Oxford University. So those people in Great Britain who know way more than most all of us. So this was actually created by Maggie Snowling and Charles Hulme, who are the most cited researchers in the field of reading. So these people know what they're talking about. So they created an app, and this app is individually administered, and it's for kids aged 3 to 11. It takes less than 10 minutes. And once you go through that app, there's a separate intervention program that can be used. And it has not only research that demonstrates that it has evidence that it helps close the gap, especially in the area of language, it also improves behavior. So again, this is something that can be administered by teachers' aides. It's very reliable. It's as reliable as if we did a standardized assessment as an SLP. So Charles Hulme is actually a school psychologist, researcher by backgrounds. Maggie Snowling is speech language pathologist. So again, quite a pair. Dr. Adloff with USC is in the process of getting the data for what's referred to as a whole classroom screening tool. In other words, the classroom teacher can administer to this whole class all at the same time. So this is something to look for, especially because it's comes specifically from our own backyard. The other one I'm going to talk about is the NLM cubed, the narrative language measure. This comes from Language Dynamics. It's free. It's for preschool through 8th grade. Preschool through 8th grade. It is, if you get the chance to do a deep dive on the Language Dynamics site on the NLM cubed, you will be blown away if you haven't already. NLM cubed is also connected to Story Champs. Some people may be familiar with Story Champs. Story Champs is specific to narrative, but it also does a fabulous deep dive into vocabulary, a beautiful deep dive into vocabulary. And that's their intervention program. They also have the Pearl. So Language Dynamics also has the Pearl. I don't believe that one is free, but they're also connected with the Pearl. And also, I don't think it's on this slide. I may have, I'm not sure what happened to it, but Language Dynamics for speech language pathologists, when you're talking about assessment, the Diamond just came out. It is a standardized dynamic assessment. And your lead SLPs have heard me talk a great deal about dynamic assessment. So this is actually a standardized dynamic assessment, and it does a really great job of not only teaching you how to do dynamic assessment, but also understand dynamic assessment. Now, there are some things that we can do too, some non-standardized screening tasks that we can do as speech language pathologists, but with this tremendous caveat. When we talk about screening, the purpose of screening is not to identify or determine who does and does not go forward with an evaluation. Only a team can make the decision about who does and does not go forward with an evaluation. One tool and one person cannot make that decision. So screenings, according to federal law, IDEA, are specifically for determining appropriate instructional strategies, meaning we're not sure if there's a disability, but we want to really make sure that we're putting some strategies in place to see if this little nudge might help. So here's a list of various non-standardized screening tasks that speech language pathologists are more specific under our umbrella. But all of this to say, whether you screen as the teacher or screen by the as the SLP, this does not negate the fact that we need to be collaborating. Because I really want you to consider that general and special education teachers, they are the ones spending the majority of the time with our students. So if we want to truly accelerate language development, we need to do it in the opportunities they have for the most language exposure. And 2 times 30 is not it. So we need to make sure that we're providing collaborative services. So that leads me to talk about collaborative IEP goals. So let's say, for example, there's a resource teacher or another special education teacher and a speech language pathologist. There's nothing in IDEA that says you can't write collaborative goals. And I want you to think about this with the spirit of IDEA. IDEA, as I even just mentioned a moment ago, everything is a team decision. And so when we're collaborating, we're really working under that spirit of team. And that to me is one of the greatest things about providing services in a school. One of the greatest benefits of public education is that we have all of these people all in the same building, all at the same time the student is. So we're able to contribute all of this expertise all together, or at least we should be. So again, IDEA does not require discipline-specific IEP goals. Instead, it says the IEP goals must be individualized to the student. Now, the beauty of a collaborative IEP goal is we're all approaching it under our different lens. So let me give you some examples of what this might look like. So let's say it's an example for targeting vocabulary. The special education teacher might really be targeting the breadth of vocabulary, meaning increasing the number of tier 1 and tier 2 words and really targeting those grade level specific terms. The speech language pathologist might be looking at the depth of vocabulary, meaning we're really going to start looking at those semantic features. We could still be targeting the grade level curricular vocabulary, but now we're looking at the depth of knowledge for that, the connections with the words, the category, the function, the location, all of those things. And then, not to forget the general education teacher, we need to know what those vocabulary words are, which words are coming up, what the content is, what the books are that are coming up, and what strategies we're all doing so that we're all on the same page with that, so that we're all using the same strategies and targeting the same words. And then in doing so, we're not just targeting those words in our little bubble, but throughout the day, which makes for more efficient remediation. Now let's talk about specially designed instruction in the least restrictive environment. So where I'm going with this discussion about specially designed instruction is to really look at which, and this has already come up, who is the most appropriate person to provide certain services? Well, there's no one answer for that because all IEPs are individualized. So instead, I want to take you through a series of questions that will help us look at that specially designed instruction in the least restrictive environment. Because again, another beauty of working in a public school is we have this continuum of support from more direct to least direct, to more restrictive to least restrictive. So some of the questions the team needs to be asking is, does the nature of that disability require an SLP? Now think about that again under the lens of ESSA and the general education teacher and your special education teachers. Everyone needs to have that same set of knowledge. And again, letters is being a huge help to make sure we all are working from that same body of knowledge. Also, does the severity of the disability require the SLP to provide those direct services? Or could indirect services or even supplementary services adequately support those needs? Now, we've already taken our break, but I'm going to jump back in to, again, what I started at the beginning by talking about how language is interwoven and overlapping. And I hope you will enjoy this as much as I enjoy sharing it. So what we're going to do is I want us to look at one passage, one social studies passage. So this is one sentence from the Declaration of Independence. So I don't think anyone would doubt that this is something that is covered in social studies. But now let's look at it under the lens of language. Let's look at it by thinking about the semantics, the syntax, the morphology, the phonology, the pragmatics, and the narrative aspects, so that we can truly see how interwoven and overlapping language is. So one sentence from the Declaration of Independence is this: but when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. So keeping that in mind and keeping that up while we're looking at it, here's some of the things I want you to think about. And again, I'm going to give you a moment to pause and discuss this with your group, or if you're watching this alone or recorded, to even jot down some thoughts. So the first question I want to ask is, what would you say are some of the tier 2 or tier 3 words? In other words, tier 1 words are the words everybody knows, but tier 2 words, and more specifically tier 3 words, are less familiar. So which tier 2 and tier 3 words do you think would need to be taught in order to understand the passage?
Usurpations, evinces, despotism.
Yes. So some of the words that I would come up with are usurpations. Who right now can even tell you exactly what that means? What about pursuing? Do you think your students know the meaning of the word pursue? What about invariably? And even look at, again, that vocabulary phrase, the same object. What object? And what about despotism? All right. Now let's look at, what would you say are some examples of figurative language? I'll tell you right off the bat, the one that jumps right off the page is a long train of abuses. That is figurative language. So is to reduce them. That is figurative language. What about to throw off? Would they know what that is? That is figurative language. The next question I'm going to ask is, when you read this passage, remember, reading is supposed to create mental images, visual images. What mental images pop up for you or should pop up? And again, a lot of that is based on background knowledge. So think about what images this pops up for you. I'll tell you that for me, some of those paintings of signing the Declaration of Independence pop up. So what I see, my visual image that I see popping up for that is the men in the white wigs with the white knee socks, and they're around a dark wooden table. They've got a feather pen, and they're all sort of taking turns signing. And then there's one signature, we all know who that is, whose signature is way bigger on that document than anybody else. That's one bit of visual imagery that pops up for me. The other one that pops up for me, if you've seen the musical Hamilton, when I see the word despotism, I see and hear King George singing the You'll Be Back song. All right, let's look at another question. Another question is to ask yourself, look at the morphology for declaration. What's the root word for declaration? It's declare. And why is declare important to know in order to comprehend the passage? Another one is, look at the word independence. Why is the prefix in important to this passage? Okay, now remember, this is one sentence. So you tell me what makes this sentence syntactically complex. Well, it's a compound complex sentence. It's got multiple independent clause and at least one dependent clause. And what might be one of the independent clauses? It is their right. What's another independent clause? It is their duty. So again, if you struggle with syntax and syntactic language, how likely is it that you're going to understand not only this document, but also just this sentence? All right, now let's think about phonology. What might make the word evinces confusing? Well, to begin with, it's very phonologically similar to convinces. And if you don't have the word evinces stored in your phonological long-term memory, you might think it's convinces, but that's not the same thing. All right, what about pragmatics? Think about this. How were the authors feeling when they wrote this? Why do you think, make an inference, why do you think they wrote it? That's definitely a question that they're going to see on some type of social studies exam. Another question might be, why is this sentence still important today? That's making a text to self comparison, which requires some meta-linguistics, some thinking about your own thinking. All right, now what about discourse and narrative? I want to ask you, what part of the bigger story does this sentence convey? What part of the story, the broader story of the Declaration of Independence? Because it's a social studies type document, but it's also a story. It's a story of how we gained our independence. So I hope y'all enjoyed that. All right, so now let's talk assessment, and more specifically IDEA. So IDEA requires 3 types of data. We have to gather functional data, developmental data, and academic data. And we gather that through a variety of tools and strategies. In other words, not just standardized assessments. And we gather these 3 types of data using a variety of tools and assessments in order to determine several things. 1, do they have a disability according to IDEA? 2, to determine the content of the IEP, which specifically includes information related to enabling the child to be involved in and progress in the general education curriculum, to progress towards those grade level standards, or, as we mentioned for a preschool student, to participate in appropriate activities. Now, if I were looking at academic data to gather with consideration for reading or under the lens of literacy and under the lens of gathering data to support adverse educational impact, because remember, that's one of the prongs of eligibility, here's some of the things that I would look for. Especially for my young children, especially kindergartners, teachers already have data on letter name and letter sound fluency. What I would do is look at which of those letter names they struggle with the most. If it's letter names like B, where the phoneme B begins the name, those are the easiest to learn. But if it's obscured, like L, like I gave that example earlier, and they're struggling with those, there's a phonological component there. So that might make that connection to the phonological awareness data that I'm gathering. I'm also going to gather a writing sample, and we'll look at that in just a minute. I also want to look at the assessments that the teachers are giving. I'm going to go through in a moment and help you look at what are those comprehension questions really looking for. I'll show you that in just a moment. Play. And again, the whole purpose of today is not to focus on preschool, but I want to stop and again, dance on the table if I have to make the connection of how important play is and the direct connection that play has to reading. And again, we could save that discussion for a whole other day, but play doesn't have indirect, it has direct connections to those foundational skills for reading. So now let's look at those reading samples, because writing samples are a peek under the hood of what their brain is doing when they write and read and write. So first, in a writing sample, the first thing I'm going to be looking for is any misspelled words. And number 1, are there misspelled words, if it's a speech sound disorder, are the misspelled words specific to the error phoneme, the sound that they struggle to produce? If it is, that is a direct connection between the speech sound disorder and adverse educational impact, meaning the way that they say it is impacting the way that they write it. But I'm also looking at, is a sound, or more specifically a letter, missing or out of place? Because if it's missing or out of place, that's telling me that there's weaknesses in phonological awareness. So specifically, if they're writing SOP for stop, there's a phoneme missing. In other words, they're not phonemically aware that there's a phoneme missing. Another example is pig for peg, which is very hard because we're from the South, but it's still important as it relates to meaning. Another thing I'll be looking for is the phonic pattern. Are the words following the expected pattern? And circling back to the rule out factor, have they been taught that pattern? I'll also be looking at those morphemes and if those affixes, the prefixes or suffixes, are appropriately represented. And I talked about this earlier when we talked about walked. They may be representing the phoneme at the end of the word, but they may not know or have been taught that it's represented by the grapheme combination of ED. Same thing with hope and hoping. They may not have been taught when you drop the E. Same thing for magic and magician. They may not be connecting in that example to the root word, which is magic. Now, when we look at comprehension tasks, let's look at what they're actually asking a student to do. I have always loved getting a social studies test. I love to connect with social studies, but what is the social studies test? What are the types of questions that they consistently miss? And what do those questions, what are they really doing? Well, if they're asking the student to comprehend 1 or 2 sentences, so there's 1 or 2 sentences and they have to answer a question about it, know that if they're only having to read and answer questions about 1 or 2 sentences, those difficulties that you might see could be more specific to word reading, the act of decoding. And so what may happen is you may have some students who we're really underestimating their deficits because they're compensator types. So there's a lot of our students who we refer to as a compensator type dyslexic. And what that means is they get by using a variety of other skills that are not decoding. And so they may be able to, they're usually quite smart little people. So they might be able to make some good guesses and use some of those 3 cueing strategies, again, that are those of a poor reader. But it may also overestimate skills of our hyperlexic kids. And hyperlexia is typically associated with autism spectrum. These are your students, and I've had them, and I have some fabulous stories about some little fellas who I would go to the teacher and I'd say, we're getting ready for annual review. Annual review is coming up. How are they doing in the classroom? So I can document that adverse educational impact. Teacher says, oh gosh, they're doing amazing. They can read like nobody's business. Then I pause and ponder and I go, let me dig a little deeper on that. So for one of my little friends who is autistic in the 1st grade, yes, buddy, he could read like nobody's business. He even read the author's name and it was Dutch or German or something I would have never expected him to be able to read. But we got to the comprehension questions. And as soon as we started asking the comprehension questions, we had a total meltdown. Why are you asking me these questions? I don't know the answers to these questions. What are you talking about? So we need to make sure that we're looking at both. In terms of question and answer, yes, those are more specifically looking at language. But even when we're looking at WH questions, we really need to ask ourselves, what is that WH question really asking? Is it asking to apply that background knowledge or long-term memory? Is it asking to make inferences? Because there's a big difference between our WH questions. Story retell types of questions are, of course, going to be aligned with language, more specifically narrative. Oral passage reading with verbal responses, I'm going to let you read through those so that you can really soak these in. So I'm going to give you just a moment so that you can soak in what we really need to be looking at and considering when we're looking at their comprehension questions based on some of the data we get from our teachers. And again, knowing this, how might this impact your data and what you use to either probe for further assessment or what you use to document adverse educational impact? Now, as we start the downward slope, let's get into application kinds of things. So first, we're going to talk about application as it relates to vocabulary and phonological awareness. So for those who weren't familiar when I was talking about the tiers of vocabulary, we're going to start with that. So the first thing I want you to appreciate for tiers of vocabulary is there is not, doesn't exist, an agreed upon list of vocabulary for age or grade. And I will tell you that when we were writing the ELA standards, one of the questions we got back from the field was, where's our list of vocabulary? It doesn't exist. And it doesn't exist because every single student is coming to your class with a different set of vocabulary. So we as educators have to be aware of that. We have to know our own students to know which and anticipate which vocabulary they may know or not know. But I'm here to tell you, I have done the legwork and done the research. Nowhere could I find that there are specifically agreed upon lists of words kids should know by certain ages. Instead, what we have is the tiers of vocabulary. So tier 1 are those words we find everywhere, used every day. Words like dog, door, train, milk, Chick-fil-A. Common words everybody should use. Our language impaired kids, those are the ones who are missing tier 1 words. I once had a 5th grader who didn't know the word ambulance. And I would dare say ambulance is a tier 1 word. Now, tier 2 words, I'll go ahead and tell you right now. Circle this, make a note, put a star by it. Tier 2 words, that's your sweet spot. Tier 2 words are your sweet spot because tier 2 words are the words we find in text, but we do not find in conversation. Tier 2 words are the ones we find in text, but we do not find in conversation. So to give you a great example of that, one of my dear friends that I work with was telling me about her very precocious young daughter, and they were reading Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. And somewhere in the passage, it talked about how Rudolph was famished. And she looked at her mom and said, what does famished mean? Why did they use that word? And she said, it means hungry. And she said, well, why didn't they just say that? Well, the reason is because hungry, which you might be feeling right now, is very different than famished. Famished means you are ridiculously hungry and you're about to chew your fingernails off. So it implies a different meaning. And because we don't have the context of being with each other when we're reading and telling stories, they have to use more advanced vocabulary, tier 2 vocabulary, in order to paint that picture of how you could be different, how hungry is different from famished. And then tier 3 words are, of course, what we typically think of when we think vocabulary. It's those highly specific curricular terms like isthmus and isosceles and hemisphere. So yeah, those are the ones that we typically see as our vocabulary lists. But I'm here to tell you, if you don't have those tier 2 words, you are going to be struggling to comprehend the passage. So let me give you an example. So I love the book Click, Clack, Moo. So I want you to think about tier 2 words, even in this very simple picture book. And why wouldn't he just say, the cows stopped making milk? Instead, why did he use the tier 2 word of strike? The cows went on strike. Why didn't the author just say the cows were tired of waiting for electric blankets? Why did he use the word impatient, which is a tier 2 word? Why did he not just say duck didn't care? Why did he use the tier 2 word, or really tier 2 phrase, of a neutral party? It's because it explains a deeper depth of meaning. So again, we were talking about depth and breadth of vocabulary. This is what we mean. The other thing I will say is that teacher use, there's some, and I can't remember if this is the slide or not, but teacher use of, it's not in there, teacher use of tier 2 words in their everyday conversation, whether it's a elementary, middle, high school, or preschool teacher. Teachers using tier 2 words in their everyday conversation has a direct impact on reading comprehension, because those words, these tier 2 words, get stored in their phonological long-term memory. Those words get stored in their phonological long-term memory. I'll talk about that a bit more when we get to phonology. So often what we see are recommendations for accommodation of pre-teaching vocabulary. Well, I'm here to tell you there's a reason why pre-teaching vocabulary isn't just an accommodation for our disordered students, but it's something we should do for every student. Pre-teaching vocabulary is something that should be done for every student, because pre-teaching is useful for everybody of every age. The cool thing, or what I really appreciate about pre-teaching vocabulary, is that when you get to that word neutral party, you don't stop reading, and then have to think about what do they mean by neutral party. You already know what it means, so you don't have to stop. So it doesn't interrupt that accumulated meaning and comprehension of the passage. Not only that, but when you don't have to stop, then you're able to apply all of those additional reading and comprehension processes, such as inference, prediction, comparing, contrasting, making connections, filtering out what is and is not important. All of that is from making sure we know those words before we come across them. So here's a big question. And when I was doing the ELA standards rollout, the high school and middle school teachers in particular were most interested in this slide. So for those of you, especially who are serving middle and high school, here's the answer to why you don't rely just on a dictionary. Why can't we just give them a list of words and they go look it up in the dictionary? Well, the number one reason is there's no research that says if you look at a dictionary and find the definition that it's helpful in any way. No research. Remember, we've got to use scientifically based reading approaches. There's no research to support that. Second, if you think about it, definitions are written to be as short and concise as possible. So if you look down at that word ambiguous, they're short definitions. So the short definition is liable to more than one interpretation or uncertain or indefinite. Now, look at the vocabulary for those definitions and think about how likely is it that your student would know the word liable, interpretation, or indefinite. So looking that up in the dictionary did not make one bit of a difference because they don't know the words within the definition. The other thing to appreciate is context. So for example, if you look at the word set, there's 67 different definitions that vary based on the context in which that word is used. So if you're just looking up definitions, but not applying it to the context of how it's being used in whatever that curricular subject is, again, you're not going to truly understand the meaning. Now, when we look at how many words should we teach, which words should we teach, the general guidance is about 3 to 5 words per reading selection, or 10 to 12 words per week for direct instruction. That's the general guidance, which again is going to vary based on your students, based on the needs, based on the content, all of the above. But in the primary grades, we're not talking middle and high school because they're going to have lots of vocabulary to learn from lots of different content areas. But this is what we're looking at in the primary grades, about 3 to 5 words per selection or 10 to 12 words per week. Now, I'm going to also add this caveat. You could do 3 to 5 words per reading selection. But think about how often you repeat that reading selection. In other words, on Monday, you may focus on these 3 words in your first reading. Tuesday, when you reread that same text, you may add an additional 3 words, and so on and so forth. So that's where I really wanted to hone in on that 3 to 5 words per reading selection. And again, we don't need to be teaching kids or giving kids vocabulary lists because we really need to make sure that we're connecting it with the context for how that word is used or word phrases, how they're used. So how do we select them? Well, number one, we've got to collaborate with the general education teacher to ask him what vocabulary or what the topic is. So when I was working on language skills with some language impaired kids, I always had a copy of the social studies book because I wanted to work with them on what was important to them. What is their work? And their work is their job is to be successful in that social studies content. And social studies tends to be pretty consistent across grade levels and classes. So then when we're looking at that content, let's say they're talking about Christopher Columbus, we want to ask ourselves, okay, how useful is this word versus that word? And go through this series of questions so that we're really targeting and pulling out words that have the greatest impact. The other thing I want to share is that there are actually 4 stages of word knowledge. And what I love about this is this can be used as a simple thumbs up or thumbs down, sort of general, getting a general idea of if your student knows these words. So the stage 1 is, I have never seen this word. I have never heard this word. I have no idea what you're talking about. Stage 2 is, that sounds familiar. I've heard this word, but gosh, I'm not really sure what it means. 3 is, oh, I know that word. I think it's got something to do with. And 4 is, oh, I got this word. I know this word. So again, you can use this to sort of gauge which words to teach, but it's also helpful because what the research tells us is the closer we can get kids' vocabulary knowledge to a 3 and 4, so I know it has something to do with, or I know this word and can use it, that's when their comprehension improves. That's when they can use those context clues and learn new words from what they read. That's the beauty of that little nugget of knowledge. Now, in terms of vocabulary and mental imagery, without question, we have to be able to picture what we're reading. So I have the picture here of The Paper Bag Princess, my all-time favorite book, and it's thinking about the paper bag princess. And what I want you to know is that mental imagery has been found to be beneficial both for listening comprehension and reading comprehension. We need to be able to make these mental images, and I'm going to demonstrate that for you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read this passage. Then I'm going to give you a pop quiz. And I'm giving you the accommodation of reading it aloud to you. So y'all should do great with this pop quiz. So here we go. The procedure is quite simple. First, you arrange things into different groups. One pile may be sufficient depending on how much there is to do. If you must go somewhere else due to lack of facilities, that's the next step. Otherwise, you're all set. It is important not to overdo things. That is, better to do too few things at once than too many. This might not seem important, but complications can easily arise. Mistakes can be expensive. After the procedure is completed, arrange the material into different groups again. Then they can be put in their appropriate places, and eventually they'll be used once more, and the whole cycle will have to be repeated. Pop quiz. How are the groups organized? What if you lack facilities? What do you need to look for in a facility? What did you do last? Anybody getting 100% so far? No, but here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to increase your comprehension 100% with 2 words. Folding, laundry. Now, I've given you those 2 words, so now what mental images pop up? A folding laundry. Now, how accurate would you be in answering the questions? How are the groups organized? Well, at my house, it depends on who's doing the laundry. What if you lack facilities? What do you need to look for in the facility? So again, just sort of bringing home the importance of mental imagery, that visual imagery. And I want to give you a quick way to check this, because in my experience, this is the #1 obstacle for our students with a language impairment to comprehension. Almost consistently, if I ask a student to look at a group of pictures and I say, show me a statue, show me a worm, show me a whatever, they can point to it, no problem. But if I say, tell me 3 things about your dog, tell me 4 things about your bedroom, things that they should have very clear visual images of, and they can't do it, that is your flag that they don't have that visual imagery, and we must teach that visual imagery if we want to ensure that they are improving their comprehension. How do we do that? Well, many of you are already familiar with the expanding expression tool. And the expanding expression tool, again, not here to sell it or anything, but it does a beautiful job of outlining how to create those mental images by working on those semantic features. What category is it? Where do you see it? What do you do with it? What does it look like? And what we want to do for our students who can't describe their dog or their bedroom, those who struggle with those visual image skills, what we want to do is move not just from word imagery but to sentence imagery. So now don't just tell me about your dog. Here's a sentence. The dog sat in the backyard. We need to now expand that image to what that looks like. Then we need to move from the dog sat in the backyard to the whole story related to Clifford or King Arthur the dog or whatever else. Because that's how we get to making these mental movies in order to comprehend. Now, I'm not going to go in depth on the instructional routine for vocabulary because you can read this and this is a resource for you. What I do want to say is this, number one and number two. First, there is something truly magical related to phonemic and phonological awareness about having students repeat the word after you that cements it in that phonological long-term memory. So when a teacher or you are introducing a new word like photosynthesis, you say photosynthesis, have them repeat it after you. Also, breaking down those phonological units by having them segment the syllables or segment the sounds. But I have to give the caveat, and I give this to every teacher that I talk to, not to clap out syllables. Why? Because in every single room, there's always that one kid who you say photosynthesis and they go photosynthesis. So now not only do we know they can't segment the syllables, they've interrupted the sound field for everybody else. So instead, we want to have them put down one finger for each syllable, photosynthesis. And then if you're also looking at not only segmentation, but counting syllables, the answer is right there. So you've automatically reduced that cognitive load and that working memory component. Now let's get into phonemic and phonological awareness. I wanted to be sure and outline the differences. So I'm going to let you use this graphic to help you look through the differences between the two. But I'm also really going to focus on why phonological awareness is so incredibly important by focusing on having you identify what's different. What's phonologically different about these words, these pairs of words. And I will tell you that the reason I do this, and I do this all the time for my general education teachers, because they're not as well versed in phonological awareness as we are. So what is the phonological difference between habit and habitat? Well, again, this is our bread and butter. We know this stuff. We know that the difference between habit and habitat is the number of syllables. What's the difference in people and pupa? Again, we know this. We know these are both consonant vowel words, but what's different? The vowel. Now, even just using those two examples, I want you to think about how impactful it is if you're not aware, not that you can't hear, but if you're not aware that those vowels are different, that those words have a difference in syllables. What's going to happen is when the teacher is talking about cocoons and pupa and things like that, that student is going to hear people. That's going to impact comprehension. Specifically, I told you about how I like to use social studies. This actually happened. I have a student who was a fluent English speaker, but a native Spanish speaker. And I was working with them on westward expansion and social studies and the gold rush. So I'm over there scaffolding and doing all the things and standing on my head and doing pictures and everything. And finally, the student looks at me and says, "Oh, you're not talking about soccer." What he heard was goal rush, not gold rush. And the reason I point to this specifically for Spanish is because Spanish does not include final consonant clusters. So if we haven't taught that aspect of English language phonology, that's going to impact their comprehension. And then in terms of affect and effect, what's going to happen is people are mostly going to say, okay, it's the vowel or whatever, but it's when you put it in conversation, contextual conversation, a lot of times those vowels are going to turn into a schwa anyway. But what's different is the syllable stress. And we've already talked about so far about how syllable stress, if you're not aware of where the syllable stress is, it's going to impact the meaning. So bottom line is, without an awareness of how words sound different, it's going to struggle to how the meaning is different. So phonological awareness, the reason this is so important is because this is what allows us to compare the words we know, those tier 1 words, with words we don't know yet. And to appreciate that we put written words into our long-term memory by anchoring them to their sounds, not their meaning. This is important enough to say again. Written words are stored. They're put into our long-term memory by anchoring them to their sounds, not their meaning. And again, this is why we need teachers using those tier 2 words, because here's what this is going to look like. Let's say you have a 3rd grade reader, he gets to that word in red. It's going to look like this. It's probably going to get to it and go suspicious, 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 suspicious. I've heard that word before, accessing that phonological long-term memory. Then it kicks over to, oh, my mom says I look suspicious when I'm in the pantry before dinner. So it clicked in here, phonological long-term memory, then it went to meaning. In contrast, they may get to a word like you see in blue, and it might go something like this. Convalesce, 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 convalesce. It never clicked here as something in their phonological long-term memory, as a word they've heard before. And so then it never went to meaning. Now, when we talk about phonological awareness instruction, I want to very clearly point out not to get stuck at awareness of words, rhyme, and syllables. Because your bread and butter, the skills that have the greatest impact on reading proficiency, are the ones down below. Specifically, blending and segmenting. Blending and segmenting have a great direct correlation with reading and spelling. So what you want to do is, yes, you want to add these things along the continuum and as they're ready. So even though we have developmental milestones for when they're expected, when they're ready to go forward and do more things, do. Because deletion tasks in kindergarten, so phoneme deletion, say blue, but don't say ooh, boo, that's predictive of 8th grade reading skills. And it's more predictive even than the DIBELS, initial sound fluency, which is another tool that general education partners use. So here's a few activity ideas, but to save time, I'm going to let you go through them. If you have more questions or you want me to go over them later, I'd be more than happy to discuss any of these. Now let's talk about morphology and syntax. This will go a little quickly, but the main thing I want you to take away from syntax is teaching this scooping, teaching the phrasing, and that when we're reading passages in these phrases, that we're really and truly focusing on the mental imagery for each phrase. So what might it look like when Fern came down slowly down the stairs? What might that look like? What image might that bring up? And of course, we know this is from Charlotte's Web because it's the character name is Fern. Here's some activities that might be helpful in terms of working on syntax. So there's this slide and this slide. And then in terms of morphological awareness, one of your handouts is, this was news to me when I found it in the research, that there's 4 levels of morphological awareness. So a lot of times when we think morphology, we think teach the morpheme, but there's actually several levels of getting them to proficiency with morphological awareness. So that's a handout that you have. In terms of pragmatics and narrative, oh yes, again, under the lens of literacy, reading and writing. So I put a list here of what skills, what pragmatic language skills, and when we're thinking about writing goals for asking and answering questions, what do they actually need to have? Then also make that connection of what are the skills they need to have to ask and answer questions to some of those ELA standards that I've already pointed out. The other thing I want to point out as it relates to pragmatics and perspective taking in particular is theory of mind. What does this look like? What's the continuum of development? And I've got in red here those verbs of cognition, perception, and intention. To me, in my practice, that has been magical to start here, to start these things in order to build that perspective taking. I've also got first order theory of mind is around age 4 or 5 and the ability to tell a lie. The reason I have that in red is because the ability to tell a lie, in order to do that, you have to be able to take on the perspective or understand the perspective of someone else. So the ability to tell a lie is then a positive marker. And then 8 to 10 years is when they start to really have that cemented understanding of figurative language and sarcasm. Figurative language in particular, I want you to think about figurative language and how you teach it. In particular, that there are categories for how we can organize our instruction in figurative language. And also to know that when you teach one idiom, you've only taught one idiom. So a way to make this very clear in the instruction in figurative language is to make sure we're teaching it in an organized way. So by body parts, by weather, by color, by time, by clothing. Then in terms of central coherence, this one is not as familiar, and you'll hear a lot more about this in the recording that we did for autism spectrum evaluation. When we talk about central coherence, a lot of our students, especially on the spectrum, they're fabulous readers. Some of them are even excellent at answering questions. What they struggle with, or what they do well with, I should say, is they can do well in answering detail questions, but they don't do well with answering inference, main idea, summarization questions. So a quick check for you. You've got a student, you're not sure if they have central coherence or not, that ability to see more than just trees, but to see the whole thing and see it as a forest. Have them look at a window, out the window, or look at a picture and ask them what they see. If they recite all of the different details, as opposed to this is a parking lot, they focus on there's a Ford, there's a Mercedes, there's a car that's got a flat tire. If they focus on that instead of saying it's a parking lot, they're only focusing on the details. That's a quick clue. We've talked about narratives and story champs before. I just wanted to give you an example kind of what this looks like. And then we're going to close with your turn. So again, this 3-hour training is designed to give you these foundational pieces to start looking at to help supporting improving outcomes in reading, both for your students and other students, and how we can collaborate and make a difference. So the your turn pieces, again, all of the different questions and activity ideas that I've sent with your lead SLP and or your special education director, so that you can now think about how you might start applying these. So I thank you very much for your time and attention. I know this is very hard to do virtually, but it's the best way I can get everybody. My email is there and you can email me with questions. And now very quickly, I'm going to go into the chat and see if there were other questions. Okay. So one of the questions is the state wanting us to move away from skills-based goals to standards-based goals? So what I'm hoping to really get across is it's not about a standards-based goal. It's about knowing the standard and working towards the standard by teaching the specific skills. So knowing what those standards are and working on those skills that get them there. Are general education teachers allowed to write a speech language goal as communicate? No. You are the expert in speech and language. You can certainly, and hopefully do get input from your general education teachers. But the person writing the goal is the person responsible for teaching the goal and progress monitoring the goal. So that's you. Since early intervention is so important, how can we get our disadvantaged, underserved families to get the help even earlier? I have many students that come into FAVK and they really need early intervention. The family didn't even know about BabyNet. That is a big, long discussion for another day. Please email me, Devin, if you want more discussion on that. And I will not take the time to do that here, but I have a lot of thoughts on that. Lots of thought. Where are the recorded webinars like the one you mentioned on autism? So those are posted on the Wakelet, and they're also being moved to Safari Montage Instructional Hub. So again, all of those things, once they're officially moved, everyone should be able to access them through the Safari Montage and Instructional Hub. Okay, any other questions? Because otherwise I'm going to stop and we will stop the recording. And then these will be ready to be shared. But otherwise, thank you so much for what you do. Thank you so much for taking the time and making the investment to listen to this and how important what we do, what we know as speech language pathologists, how much we can really contribute to helping to close the gap to help improve reading outcomes for our whole entire state. This is, I think you can probably tell this is something that I'm super passionate about, and super passionate about advocating for our SLPs to have a role in. So again, I just thank you so much for all that you do and for being brothers and sisters with me in this effort and endeavor. Thank you.